If you're cold, they're cold. Bring them inside. Welcome to 5 Points of Articulation. The 5 points I articulate are packaging, presentation, posability, playability, and price. I'm Jason, and for the entire month of October, we're going to have some very special Halloween reviews. Today we're sinking our teeth into the DC Multiverse Gold Label Walmart exclusive DC vs. Vampires Superman. And don't worry, we'll also be checking out some head swaps. Starting off with the packaging, and this is mostly a normal DC Multiverse window box. Since it's a store exclusive, it's also a gold label, and there's also that 85-year Superman logo in the corner. You know, next year is Batman's 85th anniversary. I wonder if McFarlane's gonna make any Batman figures. Nah, that'd be crazy. Superman 85 on the side. If you couldn't tell, this is from DC vs. Vampires. And while I don't think Superman ever became a vampire in the story, this was based off of one of the covers. Still don't really think a vampire should be able to bite him. And even then, since Superman's powered by the sun, I feel like it really wouldn't matter that he just be a normal vampire. Also, it might just be a case of pareidolia, but I look at this and I actually can kind of see Christopher Reeve in there somewhere. I don't know, tell me in the comments if I'm crazy or if you can see it too. Oddly enough, the comic they used to advertise DC Universe Infinite has nothing to do with DC vs. Vampires. Also, while we're down here, if you're trying to find him, here's the barcode. For packaging, I'm giving Vampire Superman 1 whole point. Moving on to presentation, and Vampire Superman stands at 7 1/4 inches. Unlike most Superman figures, he's been built on the Page Puncher's body. The S has some fancy flourishes to it and some deep red pulsating out. The belt doesn't have any loops but does point down in a V with the Superman logo as a buckle, and the boot tops have a little bit of extra detail. They've also been trimmed in silver so they really pop. Although not identical, the cape is a very similar shade of red, and I really like how minimal the use of red is in this figure. Instead, it's mostly black, though an argument could be made that it looks like a very dark midnight blue. Popular as the Page Puncher Superman is, there are a couple of things I was never that crazy about. I especially dislike the hands. For one thing, they're just gigantic in comparison to the rest of his body, and the other thing is that even though we clearly see a sleeve cuff, the wrist balls aren't flesh tone. Here, the wrist ball issue has been fixed and the hands are all new ghoulish sculpts. This time they're menacing claws and are much better proportion with the body. Truth be told, I also never really liked this head. I know some of you like it and that's fine, but it just never felt like Superman to me personally. Here, not only has Superman been given an all-new vampire head, but also a neck piece. I love the texture in the skin and also the wash to bring out all those details. Instead of a normal nose, he has the flared nostrils of a bat, as well as a deep glossy red pouring down from his fangs. I gotta say, this does look like blood. I think that the red around the eyes is supposed to represent his heat vision, but I don't think it really works. Stepping back though, there's still a pinkish rawness to it that I think is pretty scary. Continuing with the bat theme, his ears are pointed and Vulcan-like. If you look closely, you can also see the bite marks on his neck. I will say, despite being a blood-soaked creature of the night, his hair is impeccable. The leaner Page Puncher's body really lends itself well to a vampire, and between that and the color palette, it all comes together for a really nice piece. For presentation, I'm giving Vampire Superman 1 whole point. Moving on to posability, and although we have looked at Page Puncher Superman before, there's no reason not to revisit it. From the top, in cowls heads and a dumbbell joint, no trouble at all looking up to call out to the creatures of the night, and despite the open mouth, he can look down pretty decent as well. Naturally, he can tilt his head to reach into your neck and look all the way around. Moving on down, he can lift his arms just over 90 degrees, forward and back with a rotator cuff, and then traversing down the arm, he has a bicep swivel, very crunchy double jointed elbows, and McFarlane wrist balls that can swivel, and depending on the direction to point them, either hinge up and down or side to side. Moving to the middle, and Nosferatu has a diaphragm joint and a dumbbell waist. He can arch back this far, which is great for flying. In combination with his neck, this is the kind of pose you can get him in, and he can hunch forward this far, which is par for the course. Fortunately, Super Vamp has a great amount of tilt and a Transylvanian twist. Below the belt, and he has McFarlane-style hips. They can kick in the ballpark of 90 degrees and do a perfect split. No Transylvanian twist down here to speak of, unfortunately, but he does have double-jointed knees, toe articulation, and McFarlane ankles that can swivel, hinge, and pivot. For posability, I'm giving Vampire Superman 1 whole point. Moving on to playability, and Vampire Superman comes with a trading card and a figure stand. Alas, the back of the card is just a standard Superman bio and doesn't say anything about vampires. That's alright though, because in addition to these creepy, cool Count Orlok-like claws, he also comes with a pair of fists. You can tell by the fingernails that these are new and not reuse. They're also bony and desiccated, and just like Page Puncher's, a bit on the big side. If there's one thing I think a lot of people probably would have liked, it's an alternate Superman head with a closed mouth. Don't get me wrong, for something like a monster, I'm very happy with a gaping, slathering maw, but playability is more than just accessories. It's also about how well your figure plays with others. For a couple of other undead Supermen, and here we have Blackest Night and Deceased from DC Essentials. Speaking of DC Essentials, and here's Zombie Joker, but for the only other DC vs. Vampires figure in my collection, and here we have Vampire Joker. For a couple of undead Dark Knights, and here's Deceased and Blackest Night, but for a couple of Cape Crusaders from the Land of the Living, and here's Rebirth and 3 Jokers. And for those of you who prefer your Batman Blue and Gray, here's Nightfall and Hush. Just a quick reminder that Hush is the one that they used for Vampire Batman. For Quick and the Dead versions of the Justice League, and here we have the Flash. Obviously this is Deceased and Flashpoint. Here's Hal Jordan from Deceased and DC Multiverse. And then we have above and below ground versions of Aquaman. For a couple of members of the Superman family, and here we have Con-El and John Kent. This segues perfectly to some Superman villains, including Superboy Prime, Lex Luthor in his battlesuit, General Zod, and the Atomic Skull. For a relative scale comparison, here's Vampire Superman with Pizza Spidey and the Spectacular Spider-Man. And as always, here he is with Stealth Iron Man. Of course, I know the part that a lot of you are the most excited about are head swaps. First up, and here we have the original release of Action Comics 1000. This head might seem a bit small, but I think the proportions are still really good. You just have to paint the neck to blend. Unfortunately, the wrist balls are not compatible with the claws. For those of you who prefer your Superman a bit more swole, and here's the angry laser eyes version of Hush. Although I think leaner is better for a vampire, this bulkier body does give him a more monstrous quality, and using the Vampire Superman peg, the head actually sits better than Hush's. Alas, the wrist pegs aren't compatible, so you won't be able to use the claws here either. And for those of you who missed my very first YouTube short, here's a combination of Hush and the Action Comics 1000 repaint that came with Atomic Skull. I love the proportions on this combination, and just like the regular Action Comics 1000, the head looks great. For a few other potentially interesting combinations, and here we have Superman the Infected. This is the same body as Hush, but now in a more ghoulish color palette. The tattered cape really adds something, and even though you can't swap out the hands, at least this one is kinda claw-like. Next up is Dark Knight's Metal. I was mainly curious about this one because of the gray arm. If you paint the neck to match, it looks like the vampirism is taking over his body, with the left arm as the last vestiges of his humanity. Speaking of gray skin, and here we have Bizarro. Obviously, the gray on Bizarro is a bit lighter, so you would have to do some painting. You'd also have to swap out the S. But once again, you have a tattered cape, those monstrous hands to make up for the claws not swapping, and a muted color scheme that could make for a really cool Vampire Rebirth Superman. For a bulkier option in a black costume, and here Solar Suit Superman, I do think this one has some fun potential. Obviously, the black costume's a great base for a vampire, and you could swap out the hands with either the Infected or Bizarro. And then for a live action option, and here we have Henry Cavill from the Snyder Cut. This has got to be my favorite of the bunch. If I didn't before, now I definitely want a live action DC vs. Vampires movie. As nice as an extra head would have been, the head swap potential is great, and this figure does add some fun variety to the shelf. For playability, I'm giving Vampire Superman 1 whole point. This leaves us with nothing left to discuss but the price. Superman, as well as the entire DC vs. Vampires collection, is a Walmart exclusive, and therein lies the problem. Unlike Target, Walmart doesn't offer pre-orders on these, so you're stuck trying to find them in stores, and let's just say most people are stuck finding them on the aftermarket instead. I got mine for $30, which is basically retail plus shipping, so it wasn't that bad. But collecting really shouldn't have to be this much of a pain in the neck. Based on availability, for price, I'm giving Vampire Superman half a point for a still fantastic total of 4.5 out of 5. Are you collecting DC vs. Vampires? And if so, which hero do you hope they turn next? Sound off in the comments below. For more 5POAWEEN videos, check out one of these, and come back for more Halloween videos all month long. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be back again real soon, but until then, play nice, have fun, and stay spooky.